There we go.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today with Michael's, and we are going to be making this fun little rainbow fan. And we're going to be using watercolors and some foam to make your own little fan. And there's lots of options to get creative with this craft. So I'm going to go through all of our supplies we'll be using, and then we'll get started. So our first thing we're using is watercolor paper and watercolor paints. I'm using Creatology watercolor paper. If you don't have watercolor paper, any paper will work with watercolors, but a little bit thicker paper usually is ideal. So maybe a construction paper or cardstock. If you just use like notebook paper, it will work, but it definitely will, it can kind of almost tear the paper if you get too much water on it. It makes it really, really fragile. So I recommend watercolor paper from Creatology or a thicker construction paper. And then we've got our Creatology watercolor paints. I've got a couple of brushes here, and I'm just using my like thicker brushes. Any style will really work for what we're working on today. As you can see, we've got kind of just big brush strokes all the way across in like stripes of color. So we're not doing lots of detail work with this craft today. So any of our larger style brushes will be fine. And then with that, you do need some water. So I have a little jar of water here and some napkins or paper towels on the side. This is just helpful after you wash off one paint color in your jar of water. You can dry off your brush in between colors. And then we're going to be using some foam sheets. So I've just got some little white foam sheets here from Creatology as well. These are for our little clouds that we'll add to the handle of our fan. And you could definitely use other paper as well if you don't have foam sheets. The foam just adds like a different little texture, so it's kind of fun. And then lastly, we're going to be using scissors, a pencil, and glue dots. And glue dots are probably going to be the best bet today. You can staple your fan instead of glue dotting it together, but I do recommend glue dots for the foam sheet at the end. And so glue dots is just your one adhesive or fastener that you can use for everything. And I think that's everything we're going to be using today. Oh, one other thing, I have just a couple extra scrap pieces of construction paper just to paint on top of to kind of protect my surface. So depending on what your craft table or the surface you're working on, we are going to be painting our paper pretty much all the way to the edges, as you can see. So that way you can not worry about your brush getting onto your table. All right, I think that that's everything you're gonna need. So we're gonna get started with some watercoloring. I'm gonna flip my camera around so you can see my hands. All right, so to start, you can see here, I made an extra little one here of rainbow colors that we might need to use at the end of class to make the fan because your watercolor painting probably won't be dry quite in time. But this is basically what we're going to be making right now together. And as Kana said at the beginning of class as well, if you have any questions as we get started here, whether it's about different supplies, if you don't have something that we mentioned, or you want to tell me what you might be working on at home, I would love to know. So put that in the Q&A. Okay, so first I'm going to start with ripping out a sheet of paper from my Creatology watercolor paper pad here. And then I'm just going to set a couple sheets of paper underneath just to cover up my surface. The good thing is with our Creatology watercolor paints, pretty much comes off of surfaces as well, but just makes it easy cleanup. Okay, and then here is your watercolor palette. And you can see I've used mine many a time. Sometimes you might get little cracks or different things in it as it dries from using it over and over again. That's totally normal and doesn't affect the paint. And we're doing a rainbow theme, but that doesn't mean you have to make yours a rainbow. You could definitely do any color combo that you might want. So if you want to do stripes of just one or two colors instead, you can definitely do that. Or you can do the exact same method that I'm using today, which is going to be a full rainbow. And to start with the rainbow, we are going to bring our water in here. I'm going to get my brush wet. I like to kind of dip it in to my jar of water and kind of smush it onto the bottom of my jar just to make sure that I'm absorbing a lot of water. Especially the first time you use a color, you want to get a good amount of water in the paint little pod here so that it will turn into a liquid paint. Right now it's a solid paint, so you want to get a little bit of water kind of pooling on top. And I'm going to start from the top down. And so we're going to start with purple at the top, or indigo if we're going in Roy violet and then indigo. So we're going to start with the violet and purple colors first. And you can mix and match. There's a couple different shades of purple throughout your palette. So I'm just kind of dropping some of my water into my palette, and I kind of can push the edge of my brush onto the edge of the little paint pod there, and that will drop a little bit more water. And then just take your paintbrush and kind of smush it around in the paint color, make it dance a little bit there so it starts to absorb lots of color. You can start to see there's purple paint on my red paintbrush. And then we're going to start by doing just loose stripes across the top. And watercolor is great that it is really buildable. And when I say that, I mean that you can add layers of it to darken the color. So sometimes when you're using other paints that are thicker, it might not be as transparent. As you can see here, you can still see a lot of the white paper through my paint, but it also leaves a really pretty washy color, as well as you can easily add multiple layers to make the colors more vibrant when they dry. So I'm going all the way across, as you can see here. And you just dip in for a little extra paint or a little extra water as you need. And again, just kind of wiggling my paintbrush, doing little circles with it to pick up a little extra paint. And then coming back over and kind of laying a little extra paint on top. And to get it to be more buildable and to add layers, you kind of have to let each layer dry in between. So we can move on to our next color. So I'm going to rinse out my brush a little bit. I just like to just dry it off, make sure that it looks totally rinsed out. And then we can move into a blue color. And I'm starting with a darker blue. And doing the same thing that we did with the purple. And then start to drag that color just below the purple. I'm leaving a little bit of a gap here, just while it's really puddly with water. I want some of that abstract color to kind of dry in little puddles, so it gives it some pretty watercolor detail. But if you mix it too early between them, it can really muddy the colors and blend too fast, instead of leaving stripes. So we're going to come back through as these start to dry just a tiny bit. We'll do a couple colors and then kind of come back and blend them together. And you can dab it, you can kind of swirl it. All of those different marks you leave will dry differently. And as you can see here in the purple already, along the edge, some of that's pooling is going to be darker than an area over here that is thinner paint. We're going to do the same thing going into our light blue. And you can vary your stripe sizes too. Maybe you want to do a bigger stripe of purple and less blue, or As we get into greens and yellow, if you have a favorite color, you want it to be a bigger stripe. They don't have to all be the same. You can vary the size of them. And then moving into a darker green. And you can start to see on your paper, especially if you look from the side, if you kind of tilt your head, you can start to see areas that are drying in your first couple colors. And if you still have big puddles like I do in the light blue here, I'm going to wait a little longer to blend these. But my purple and my dark blue are starting to dry just a little bit so that we can kind of blend those colors. And to do that, just rinsing my brush out again. You can take just a little bit of color. You don't need a ton. You don't need a ton of water. And just start to kind of paint right over that little stripe. I like to kind of wiggle the tip of my brush, just kind of blur any hard lines that may be started where they're drying. As you can see, getting a little bit of pooling that's starting to between them, which I think is really pretty, but it's not moving too much. We're just kind of blurring that line without the entire two colors blending into one stripe. And that's why I kind of like to let them dry a little bit first. It's also what's fun about watercolor is you can kind of take things away just as much as you can add. So say you have a pool happening of one color and you don't want that, dry off your brush and lay that brush right on top of that pool and it will absorb that color, and then you can come back in and add a little bit more purple there if you want to. And once you have some paint in your paint pods here, you can see a couple of these that have, there's little puddles in them compared to this one that's like really dry. You don't have to keep adding a ton. It doesn't have to be really soupy. It just has to be enough water in there to get on your brush again. And that way you can add more color in where you want it. Just adding in a little bit more dark blue along that center line. And then as that starts to dry, see already over here, kind of blending together really pretty. And I kind of like to do little like dab motions and swirls, as you can see I'm doing with my brush. And that gives it more of like an abstract paint um, detail, where if you do long, clean washes of paint, that's really pretty. You can do that style as well. Or if you wanted to kind of have a little bit more of a abstract lines, then giving it a little swirls and dabs and letting water pool in certain places will leave you with all of those pretty lines at the end. And here I'm just going to add a little bit more violet, purple, just to darken it up a tiny bit. All right, so I'm going to continue to let these dry a little bit, these stripes, so we can move on down to our yellow stripe below the green. We can also do a lighter green in between. So we started with our dark green here. Maybe we do a little bright light green as a good transition into the yellow. This one maybe is going to be a little bit smaller, just as a transition color, which I think is really pretty. It's going to add some nice pop of green in there, like a limey green. And next we can move into our yellow. Starting to see our rainbow come together here. I'm going to move into our orange and then finish with our red. I'm dabbing and moving that color around within my color stripe. And up here, as you can see, this first two colors that we blended at the top are purple and blue. This is some of my favorite parts of watercolor personally, where you start to see sort of these like contrasty dark lines where the puddles of water kind of finished and you can see the edges of them. I always think that those look really pretty, so I like that style. But again, you could definitely do long, clean washes instead of little puddles, and it would look differently. So it's totally up to you. There's lots of styles and ways to watercolor. But starting to dry a little bit in between those colors. We're going to get our red on here, and then we'll go back up and start to blend all of these together more. There we've got all of our colors on there. So now we're going to go back and continue to blend them, starting from the top again. So we blended our first colors here as those were drying first. Now we'll come back in with a little bit of light blue on here. I'm going to start kind of doing little swirls, kind of wiggling the ends of my brush, and that will start to lighten up any color, any like lines that have started to dry, and blend those colors without the water pooling drastically between them. It'll continue to move as it dries, and that's part of the fun that we like about watercolor. And just going slowly in between these colors and just kind of adding a little bit more paint as we go. As you can see here, I'm just adding a little bit more green paint on top of where it's already wet. My brush isn't really that wet anymore. It's still damp, of course, but instead of adding a lot more water, I'm just kind of adding a little bit more color into the mix, and it will puddle there just to darken up that bright green. And it will slowly start to grow all together. You can also move your paper if you ever want to, and you can see that the water will start to run as well, so you can manipulate the colors that way If you want to keep them in the stripes, just make sure to always lift it from the side and not from the top or bottom. And so that way you can kind of run them down. They'll stay within their striped lines, but kind of run that water and color down the whole color stripe. Kind of a different fun way to play with the color. And there we've blended all of our shades. They're obviously going to take a little bit to dry here. You can see that I still got lots of puddling and pulling as I move my paper around a little bit. But that's of course all the pretty fun parts of watercolor. As they dry, they kind of all blend together and they'll leave these really pretty darker moments and edges of contrast and be really beautiful. So that's going to be our first step in making your rainbow fan. So you're going to want to let that totally dry before you start folding your fan. If you fold it now, you'll just end up with a big mess. It'll probably turn into brown instead of rainbow, and will probably all stick together. So you're going to set that aside, and then you can just follow along to know what to do as soon as your rainbow is dry. It'll look something like this when it's all dry. You can see here. And like I was saying, some edges of contrast, some of this that pulled further. I've got some color kind of blending over each other, but all of that is really fun. Okay, so our next step is going to be making this into a fan, which requires an accordion fold. So to do that, we are going to start by flipping over our painting, and I'm going to fold just this little edge back about 1/2 inch. And then I'm going to flip my paper over. And this little edge I just folded, we're going to fold back over, and I'm going to line up my edges so that it's the same like width of a fold. And now your paper should look like that. We've got a little like hill here, 2 little folds. I'm going to turn it over and do that again. So we're going to do this back and forth, folding onto itself. As you can see, that's what's going to make our accordion look when we're done. And so you just have to keep going back and forth, trying to keep it in line so that all of your folds are right on top of each other so that they're the same width of a fold. You can see all my little creases here are lining up. And I find it usually the easiest to start from one end and kind of look to the side of your paper here, make sure that that little crease is lining up. Give that a nice little press. And then that gives you your starting point to slowly go down the whole paper, lining it up as you go. Start to see it coming together here. Keep going. This part of the craft, of course, is repetitive as we're going back and forth here a little bit. And as you can see, as I'm folding this, folding it sort of long way up. So I laid out my paper to be long or tall. That's going to give you more folds because you've got more paper to fold. If you do it horizontally and fold it that way, you're going to have less folds, making a taller fan, but less fan is going to be there. It's going to be tall, but really tall and skinny versus having a little bit more width to your fan. Almost there. Got like 2 more folds in here. Last one. Fold up the last little edge here. And now this is what your paper should look like. A little accordion here, which is looking so pretty. And you can choose which side you want to be the top or the bottom. If you want more purple to show, then I would have this be your top. If you want more red to show, you can flip it around to have that be the top, because then we're going to connect it at the bottom. And here's where you've got a couple options. I'm going to be using glue dots today, but you can also use a stapler. So if you, it might be hard to get through the bottom of this because it is pretty thick. So that's where you might need to craft with an adult or ask an adult for help. But if you want to, you could easily just do a single staple in the bottom of this and that will hold it all together. Or we can take our glue dots, which if you're not familiar with the glue dots, of course, get these at Michael's, and they're just little perfect dots of sticky. You can kind of see just barely, there's like a little, it's hard to see on camera, but you can see here, if I pull one off, just like a little sticky dot. And so what I'm going to do is put sticky dots in between the bottom of my folds and then squeeze that together to lock it in place. You could do this with a liquid glue as well. It's just going to take longer for it to dry, which you'll have patience after waiting for your watercolor to dry, but you'll have to hold it while that liquid glue dries. So that's one of the tricks with liquid glue that's different than, say, glue dots. Once you kind of give it a little bit of pressure, it will hold. Where liquid glue, you need to kind of hold it in place the whole time or a good chunk of time while it's drying. If it doesn't have pressure behind it, it will just fall apart again. I'm just kind of pulling these off with my fingers and then just sticking a glue dot in between each fold and then just squeezing that. I'm doing it on the back side. I think we'll be okay with the back of it. We can always add a couple more on the front as well. But I think the back without the paint is going to be the thing that's going to keep it together the best. Sometimes glue doesn't like paint or substances on the front of the paper. Do one more on the end here. I can flip that over. It's holding together pretty well, which is great. I'm just going to add a couple of glue dots on the front just to add a little bit of strength there and keeping our fan shape nice and secure. And look how cute this rainbow tie-dye look is. At this point, ultimately, your fan is done. It could be done if you want to. It does work. You can definitely fan yourself with it. Also would be really pretty as just a piece of art. But we're going to add some little clouds to this next. So that step is definitely optional. But I think that they're awfully cute. And so to do that, I'm going to switch over to my foam sheet here. And I've just got a couple scraps of white foam sheets You can make your clouds out of any color if you want to use a different color, or again, if you want to make it out of paper, that will work just as well. And I'm going to use a marker just so it's easier for you to see, but a pencil will absolutely work on the foam sheet and actually erases pretty well also. So it's almost easier sometimes to use that. You'll get more of the border off of there versus the marker is going to be so much darker. But I'm going to use the marker just so you can see a little bit easier on camera. And so we're just going to freehand draw a couple of cloud shapes. And I'm sure that you've sat in the park or in your backyard and stared up at the sky, and clouds come in countless sizes and styles and shapes. So you can really make it any way that you want. Maybe you want to be long and narrow, or you want to do big bubbly clouds. It's totally up to you. I'm going to kind of do bubble edge clouds here. And I'm going to draw a second one on another little sheet here that's a little bit smaller. So I want to layer them together. And I always like to kind of have different size things. If you're going to layer them, it gives a little bit more interest or composition to your artwork. So now that I know how big this is, if I want to do one smaller, I can just kind of look at that and keep in mind that it's going to be littler. But again, you don't have to do clouds. Maybe you want to do, draw a unicorn, or you want to do stars or moons, or a pot of gold. You could totally do any sort of little detail to add to the bottom to kind of act as a handle. Okay, so we're going to take our scissors, and I'm just going to cut right along the line here. I'm just cutting kind of right on the inside line. You can always turn it over so you won't see any of your marker lines, but if you cut along the inner edge of your line, it helps make it just disappear. And also paint foam sheets, so if you want to paint some details or cute little faces on there, you could do that. Maybe add some glitter, sequins. Who says that a cloud can't have a sequin? Here's my first little cloud. And I'm just cutting right along the edge here. As you can see, I'm cutting. I try to get my foam sheet or my paper, any material, as far into the handle as possible. You have more control with your scissors the closer it is to your handle. So pull that all the way in. Open your scissors as wide as your hand can, and then start to take a bite with them. Have a little bit more control of them. And if you're cutting through thicker material, it's usually easier as well. If you always cut with just the tip of your scissors, sometimes it actually can leave a little tear mark in whatever you're doing when the tips kind of meet, and it adds a little extra cut. So I try to avoid cutting directly. You see here, if I do, it just ever so slightly leaves a little extra mark with the tip of the scissors that you can just avoid if you don't ever let this tip of the scissors fully collapse on your paper. Okay, so now I've got a couple of cute clouds here. We're going to take our fan back and we're going to attach it with some more glue dots. And I'm going to put the glue dots on top of the fan here, just so that I know that my cloud will cover that space rather than on the back of my cloud and maybe it hangs off the edge. Every once in a while, a glue dot prefers to stick to your finger. I'm going to take my cloud now here. I can see where my glue dots are, and I'm just going to press onto where the glue dots are. See how quick and easy it folds it on. And then we can add a second little cloud here. And now I'm going to kind of place where I want it to be. If that's where I want my cloud to live, kind of covers up a chunk of the bottom there. If you want more of your bottom to show of your fan, that's fine. It's up to you. Kind of like it to almost act like a little handle at the bottom. So then I'm going to know that I can add all my glue dots right along the top here. It will just stick directly to the other cloud. You don't need a ton. I usually do 2 or 3. Press that on. And there you have your newly made rainbow fan ready to go and ready to use. You can see, you can grab it from the back or you can hold it from the clouds. Either way, you can fan yourself, fan a friend, or give it as a gift. It's super cute and full of color. I hope that you guys had so much fun crafting with me and Michael's and making your own little rainbow fan today. I know I definitely did. And if you enjoyed crafting and you want to craft some more with me this week, join me on Wednesday afternoon. We'll be making some super cute little bug banners for springtime using foam sheets and lots of fun details from Creatology. So thanks so much for crafting with us, and we'll see you soon. Bye.